Welcome to Wisdom Wednesdays. Tonight's speaker is, I could fair to say, an international speaker. She's going to be linking some of the issues we've been talking about from Nepal with more global issues, things that are happening in other countries as well, which I think is fascinating. She works for one of the leading organisations in the world that advocates for the importance of children growing up with families, and I think it's fair to say that she's probably one of the leading thinkers and speakers in this issue at the moment around the world, this niche area of family-based care. And it's a pleasure for me to introduce you to her. So can we have a warm round of applause for Emily Delap from Family for Every Child?
Thank you, Martin. So, as Martin's already mentioned to you, this series of talks is really about trying to think about the issue of becoming a more ethical tourist, and particularly about thinking about how you can volunteer ethically. And what I want to try and do is to try and think about how we can provide a bit of global context to this debate, to what's happening in Nepal. And I want to try and show to you that what organisations like NGN and UNICEF and many other organisations are doing in Nepal is not just unique to Nepal. There's a whole movement all around the world of organisations trying to prevent the overuse of orphanages, and particularly trying to stop people from volunteering in orphanages. So I'm going to try and demonstrate that to you today. So I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit about the organisation that I work for, which is called, as Martin mentioned, Family for Every Child. And we are a global network of national NGOs or national charities working all over the world. And our mission is to try and enable children to grow up safe and protected in families. And we're not naive. We recognise that not all families are safe places for children to be, and that abuse and neglect does happen within families. So we do acknowledge that sometimes you need to find alternative places where children can be safe. But we're very worried about the use of orphanages around the world. We think that very small scale, very high quality orphanages can be beneficial for some children for short-term care. But what we found in the countries that we work in is that often orphanages are not of high quality and they're not used in the short term, and we're very concerned about that, and I'm going to explain a bit more about why we're so worried about that in a minute. This map shows all of our members all around the world. We currently have members working in 24 countries. Last week we just got a new member from Nepal, but we haven't had a chance to update the map, so there's a couple of dots missing. And what I think this map shows is that this issue is all over the world. It's affecting children in a very wide range of contexts. So these are organisations that have all come together to work together to try and reduce the use of to reduce the use of orphanages. And they come from contexts as diverse as Mexico, we have members in Russia, we have members from Indonesia, from India, from Rwanda, from all over the world, where they're facing common problems and common challenges with children not being given enough support to enable them to grow up in families. So I want to try and demonstrate to you why we think children growing up in orphanages and not being with families is such a problem. And I'm going to try and present 4 arguments for this. The first argument is around child development and the research and evidence base that we have on children's development. Now, in many orphanages, children don't have the ability to form a strong bond, a strong relationship with one consistent carer. And often this is because there are simply too many children in the orphanage and too few staff, so the ratio between children to staff is too high for staff to give children individualised, consistent attention. It may be because staff work in shift systems and they're changing every few days. And it may also be because there's a high turnover of staff, and this can be exacerbated by a reliance on volunteers who come in for 2 or 3 months and then leave. So children aren't able to form this strong bond and this consistent relationship with one carer. And We've known since the 1960s that having this relationship with one carer has a very fundamental impact on children's development, on their health and on their well-being. So it can affect their ability to form relationships, it can affect their brain development, their physical development, and their language and their intelligence. And I think, to me, the most shocking aspects of these this very large body of evidence that we have on the impact of orphanages on children is that orphanages can actually have a physical impact on children's brain development. So people have investigated how children's brains develop and grow within orphanages and compared them to children outside of orphanages. And it's actually had a physical detrimental impact on children's brain development. Secondly, I think that the most shocking thing to me is that orphanages can actually increase or cause disability within children. So there's evidence from the former Soviet Union that more children leave residential care, leave orphanages with disabilities than enter orphanages with disabilities. And the really sad thing about the fact that orphanages can cause or exacerbate disabilities is once you have a disability as a child, your chances of being treated well and being well looked after within orphanages diminish further. So I wanted to share this quote with you. This is from an organisation called Disability Rights International, who went and investigated orphanages in Serbia. They've also done this research in a number of other countries. And the quote says, for those of you that can't read it at the back, "I looked into the crib and I saw a child who looked to be 7 or 8 years old. The nurse told me he was 21 and had been at the institution for 11 years. I asked how often he was taken out of the crib, and she says never. He has never been out of the crib in 11 years. And sadly, this is fairly typical treatment for children who have disabilities and are in residential care in many countries in the world. And I wanted to stress here that this evidence on lack of attachment isn't just coming from these very large-scale institutions that you might associate with images such as this, or from the pictures that those of you who are old enough might remember from the Romanian orphanage scandal that was revealed after the fall of the Soviet Union. It also can happen in institutions like this, which are much smaller scale. And it's really all to do with how care is organised, whether children are able to form a bond with a consistent carer, whether there are small enough groups of children for a carer to provide enough individualised attention to children. And of course, the easiest and the simplest way for children to get this bond and to get this attachment is for them to grow up in families. So the second reason why we're really concerned about children growing up within orphanages is the risk of abuse and isolation. And we think these two things are closely related. So, as demonstrated by this picture, orphanages are often isolated from wider communities. Children are often kept behind closed doors. And they often don't see their families. Sometimes they might go to school within the orphanage grounds. Sometimes they might receive an education within the orphanage grounds. And this can make it really hard for them to understand normal life, how to get around, how to shop, about the culture and traditions of their communities. And it can also make it really hard for them when they go home after they've been in orphanages or when they grow up and they try and live as individuals in the wider community. And this isolation can also make children particularly vulnerable to abuse. So if within the orphanages there are not enough measures being put in place to protect children, if there's lots of staff or lots of children and there's very little efforts to regulate them and to check that they're not being abused, and if children are also isolated behind closed doors, there's no one that they can go to report this abuse to. And really sadly, there is a lot of evidence from around the world that abuse and bullying in orphanages is very common, especially in countries where orphanage care is very poorly regulated and where there's a lack of attention paid to protecting children. And this isolation within orphanages from families and communities, I think, also has an effect on children's sense of identity. And I'd like you to think about all of the traditions that you have with your families, the language that you've gained from your families, the culture, the religion perhaps that you've learned from your parents, and think about how it would be to grow up without that. And many children in orphanages do not have that. So, the third reason why growing up within orphanages can be so challenging for children comes from children themselves. And I wanted to share 3 quotes for you, which are from children from a range of different contexts. And I think these really represent the wider global research that we've done with children who have grown up in orphanages in many different settings. And the overwhelming evidence suggests that these children would much rather be within families. And this is the case even in situations of really extreme poverty, which I think is illustrated by the first quote. So the first quote is from a child in El Salvador who says, "In the orphanage, the substitute mothers could not give us the love of a true mother. We didn't have our parents' care, and that is something terrible. We would have really wanted to have it, even if we were starving poor. We would have wanted to have the care that each child deserves." And the second quote is from a child in Moldova. "We miss home, all the children miss home, their mothers, the love of their parents." And the third quote is from a child in Malawi. "It is better to have a home and to be visited by relatives. You feel safe when you belong to a family." And I think there's something really fundamental about the love that family members provide that can't be provided within orphanages. And I think to me, and that's no matter how well qualified the carers are or how well intentioned they are, and I think that's about the unconditional and unending nature of the love that is provided within families. And I think once children leave care, whether it's residential care or foster care, often their relationship with their carer ends. Where the children in families, their relationship continues into adulthood. And I think having that sense of permanency, of knowing that your parent or your carer is always going to be there for you, is really important. And children who grow up in orphanages don't have that, and it's a real loss to them. So we in Family for Every Child ask children all over the world to describe to us what families mean to them and why growing up within a family is so important to them. We used a method called digital storytelling to help children to articulate how they feel about their families. So this method involves giving children iPads and teaching them how to compile a series of still images and to write their own stories and to share their own stories through this technique.
मेरा नाम असलम है। मैं 15 साल का हूँ और दिल्ली में रहता हूँ। सब बच्चों की तरह मैं भी स्कूल में पढ़ता था। मुझे खेलने का बहुत शौक़ था और मैं अपने घर के पास के पार्क में खेलने जाया करता था। वहाँ और भी लड़के खेलते थे। मैं उनके साथ क्रिकेट और फुटबॉल खेलता था। एक दिन मैं पार्क में गया तो मुझे मेरा एक पुराना दोस्त मिला। उसके हाथ में एक मैला सा कपड़ा था जिसे वो बार बार सूंघ रहा था। मैंने उससे कहा, यार तू ये क्या सूंघ रहा है, दिखा मैं भी सूंघ कर देखता हूँ। जब मैंने उसे सूंघा तो अचानक मेरी सारी थकान दूर हो गई और मुझे नशा सा महसूस हुआ। मुझे बहुत अच्छा लगा और मैंने उसे दोबारा सूंघा। अगले दिन वो फिर मुझे मिला तो मैंने फिर उसके कपड़े को लेकर उसे सूंघा। धीरे धीरे मुझे इसकी आदत लग गई। मैं रोज़ रोज़ नशे की तलाश में रहने लगा। मेरे जो दोस्त नशा करते थे मैं उनके साथ रहकर नशा करने लगा। एक दिन मैं सड़क के किनारे नशा कर रहा था। नशा करते हुए रोड क्रॉस करने लगा। अचानक मैंने देखा मेरा भाई सामने से आ रहा था। उसने मुझे नशा लेते हुए देखकर पहले तो मुझे बहुत मारा और फिर जब उसका गुस्सा थोड़ा कम हुआ तो उसने मुझे बाद में समझाया भी। मैं उसकी बात नहीं समझा और नशा करता रहा। मैं खाना कम खाता था और नशा ज़्यादा करता था। मैंने घर जाना भी छोड़ दिया। मैं अपने नशे वाले दोस्तों के साथ सड़क पर या पार्क में ही रहने लगा और वहीं सोने लगा। हर महीने मेरा भाई मुझे पकड़कर घर ले जाता था, जहाँ मेरी मम्मी भी मुझे बहुत समझाती थी। तब मैं सोचता था कि नशा छोड़ दूँ, पर जब मैं दोस्तों के पास जाता था तो मम्मी की सारी बातें भूल जाता था। ये सब 2 साल तक चलता रहा। 2 साल तक मैं यूं ही सड़कों पर भटकता रहा। इस बीच मेरे स्कूल के दोस्त छूट गए और मैं कबाड़ियों की तरह घूमने लगा। मेरी माँ मुझे बहुत समझाती और रोती रहती थी। उन्हें रोता देखकर मुझे बहुत बुरा लगता था। उन्हें देखकर मैं अपनी आगे की ज़िंदगी के बारे में सोचता, कब तक मैं यूं ही नशा करके अपनी ज़िंदगी बर्बाद करता रहूँगा। अपने साथ साथ मैं अपने परिवार को भी कितना दुख पहुँचा रहा हूँ। बस अब मुझे ये सब बंद करना होगा और मैंने धीरे धीरे नशा कम करना शुरू किया। नशा कम करने में मेरी माँ ने भी मेरा बहुत साथ दिया। उन्होंने मुझे नशा छोड़ते वक्त हुई तकलीफ़ को समझा और बराबर मेरा हौसला बढ़ाया। मैं चाहे कितना भी नशे में रहा, घर छोड़ दिया, सड़क पर रहने लगा, लेकिन मेरी माँ ने कभी मेरा साथ नहीं छोड़ा। जब भी मैं घर जाता वह हमेशा ही मुझे समझाती और मेरा ख्याल रखती। उन्हीं के साथ की वजह से मैं पूरी तरह से नशा छोड़ने में कामयाब हुआ। नशा छोड़ने के बाद कुछ दिन बाद मैंने माँ से कहा, मम्मी मेरा नाम स्कूल में लिखवा दो, मैं फिर से स्कूल पढ़ूँगा। माँ बोली, बेटा मैं बहुत खुश हूँ, मुझे ऐसा लग रहा है कि मेरा बेटा मुझे वापस मिल गया है। अब कभी कभी बीते दिनों के बारे में सोचता हूँ तो लगता है कि अगर मेरा परिवार मेरी मदद नहीं करता तो मैं कभी नशा नहीं छोड़ पाता। मेरे परिवार की वजह से मैं इस बुरी लत को छोड़कर फिर से पहले की तरह परिवार के साथ रहकर अपनी पढ़ाई शुरू कर पाया। असलम।
So I hope that you've seen from this film how important families are to children, how much guidance and support that they give to children. And what we've seen from the research and from the discussions we've had with children once they've left orphanages, having grown up in them, is that many children become addicted to substances. In Russia, the suicide rate for children who've grown up in orphanages is extremely high, for example. Now, these problems persist into adulthood. But if children are with families, often their families can help turn them around and help them to face some of the challenges that they experience as children and as young people. So the fourth reason why we think supporting children to grow up in orphanages is such a bad idea is because of the global guidance around this. So it's not just Family for Every Child or NGN who think that this is a problem. The UN and agencies like UNICEF also think that this is really, really problematic. So I'm going to talk about two pieces of global guidance. The first is the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the most widely ratified and quickly ratified convention in the history of the UN, and all but 2 countries have ratified this convention. And in its preamble, the convention states that the child, for the full and harmonious development of his or her personality, should grow up in a family environment in an atmosphere of love, happiness and understanding. So this convention, which has been ratified by virtually all countries in the world, is recognising that children need to grow up within families and not spend their childhoods outside of families in orphanages. And the second piece of global guidance is more recent. It's from 2009, and it's the guidelines for the alternative care of children. And again, these have been welcomed by the UN. And these guidelines state that priority should be given to prevention and to reintegration, to supporting children to stay within families or providing support to children who are separated to return to families. They don't call for an outright ban on all forms of orphanages or all forms of residential care, but they do state that alternative care should be family-based or as family-like as possible. And they do call for alternatives to be developed to the use of large-scale residential care facilities. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, when we're talking about large-scale facilities, we're not just saying that there have to be these huge institutions with thousands of children in them. It's about large groups of children being cared for collectively and not receiving individualised care. And when I say large, I'm talking about 12 or more children being cared for collectively. We have known about the harm caused by orphanages since the 1960s. There has been global agreement from the major child protection agencies about the harm caused by orphanages for decades. We have global guidance calling for an end to the use of residential care, especially large-scale care, and especially for the long-term care of children. Yet orphanages continue to persist in many parts of the world, and in many countries the use of orphanages is growing unchecked. They're not regulated and they're increasing all the time. And I want to try and explain why I think this is happening. And I think this is probably because of 4 myths, and I'm going to talk you through each of the myths up here in turn. So the first myth is that children in orphanages are there because they are orphans. And it may come as a surprise to you, but the vast majority of children in orphanages around the world, including Nepal, have a living parent, and even more have other family members that could potentially care for them. So, these figures are on the percentage of children in residential care who have lost both parents. So in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, it's only around 2 to 5% of children who are in orphanages who are actually orphans, who don't have a parent. In Sri Lanka, it's around 2%. In Zimbabwe and South Africa, it's a little bit higher, 41 and 54%. But these figures come from, are a little bit dated, and they come from the height of the HIV epidemic. So I suspect they've probably fallen a bit now. And in Nepal, there's varying estimates, but it's somewhere between 15 and 40% of children in orphanages are not orphans. So often these parents, these one parents maybe, or 2 parents who are still living for children in orphanages, or other family members, could look after children with just a little bit more support. But orphanages may be exacerbating the lack of support that families receive because they're so expensive. They're draining resources away from support to families and into orphanages. Residential care can be 3 to 5 times more expensive than foster care, and 8 times more expensive than providing social services support to families. So it's very, very expensive. And orphanages can also act as a draw, pulling children away from families with the promise of something better. And this might be better schooling, it might be better food, it might be better healthcare. And whilst in the short term they might get this something better from orphanages, I think it would be far more sustainable if we instead invested the resources that we're putting into orphanages, into families and communities, into education, with schools close to their homes, into their clinics, into providing direct support to families. And once you open an orphanage, it's very hard to close it. So in Rwanda, after the genocide, and in Indonesia, after the tsunami, there was a very rapid expansion in the number of orphanages. And this is a legacy that is still affecting these countries today. Many of the orphanages that were opened at this time still exist today. And the really sad thing is that they weren't really needed. So in Indonesia, in the province of Aceh, which was very badly affected by the tsunami, 15,000 children were separated from their families following the tsunami. But in the vast majority of cases, they were taken in by friends and neighbours, and in many cases, they were reunited with their families eventually. And I think we're seeing similar patterns following the earthquake in Nepal. Very few children lost both of their parents following the earthquake, and very few children were in need of some form of alternative care. Most children were cared for and are still being cared for by the community. So I think here, if you want to do something to support earthquake-affected children, then it would be better if you could invest your time and resources in offering support to families than in offering support to orphanages. Okay, the second myth is that children need to be in orphanages because they face extreme abuse and neglect in their families or extreme poverty. As I think I mentioned, the global research and within Family for Every Child, we recognise we don't have a sort of rose-tinted image of families as being universally happy and safe places for children to be. And we do know that abuse and neglect and violence does happen in families. However, I would argue really strongly that the existence of abuse and neglect within families is not a justification necessarily for always removing the child from the family and allowing them to grow up in orphanages. It is often possible to address violence and abuse within families. For example, rather than removing the child from the family, you could instead decide to remove the abuser. Or you could work extensively with the family to try and reduce violence in the family. And where this isn't possible, orphanages shouldn't be your first port of call. Often there are other family members who are available to look after children and who could take them in, and that's always the first thing that we need to do. And when this isn't possible, in extreme cases where attempts have been made to work with families to try and resolve abuse or violence, then adoption or long-term foster care can be another option for children, which allows them to grow up in families. And I would say that the abuse and neglect that children experience make it even more problematic for them to be placed in orphanages, especially when the quality of care is poor, as is often the case. These children really need love and support. They really need individualised attention. And also, as I've shown earlier, there is a lot of abuse and bullying in orphanages. So you may be making life worse for them. So in relation to poverty, I think I've already tried to counteract this poverty because families can't afford to feed them perhaps, or often because they can't afford to send them to school. But I think using orphanages to solve this problem it doesn't make sense because orphanages themselves are so expensive. So it would be far more sustainable, much cheaper, you'd be able to reach a much wider range of families if you instead invested the resources into those families and into those communities and into providing services locally. Okay, the third myth is if the quality of care in orphanages is good, it's fine for children to grow up in orphanages. And I think it is true that not orphanages are the same, and some are much better than others, and some are able to offer really good quality care and to address some of the problems that I've described. So if you have more staff and very widely trained staff, you can address those issues of attachment I talked about, and you can address issues of abuse and neglect as well by putting the right procedures and protocols in place. But I would say no matter how good the care is in orphanages, we should not allow children to grow up in them. The care that they receive in orphanages should only ever be temporary. Children shouldn't have to spend all of their childhood outside of their families. And I think I've already covered some of the reasons for this, that children need that unconditional and unending love that families can provide, and that sense of security to know that their relationships with the key carers in their lives are permanent, and the sense of identity and belonging that families and communities bring that cannot be replaced in an orphanage, no matter how good quality the care is. And I think we need to consider if we want regimented childhoods or if we want children to receive more individualised love and support. And as I've already mentioned, I'm not alone in believing this. So the guidelines for the alternative care of children, which have been welcomed by the UN, state that all forms of alternative care should be temporary. So, just sort of briefly say when I think it is okay to use orphanages. I think it's okay in short-term cases where there is a very strong focus on family tracing and on children's reintegration. And I would say that the work that the NGN is doing and the residential care that they provide is entirely focused on trying to get children back into families and finding families and trying to get them back into families. So, for example, if a child has been rescued from trafficking, they might need a safe place to stay while families are found, and also they might need some time for them to prepare for reintegration and for their families to get ready to have the child back. And in some cases, we won't be able to find families for children, or we'll find that families can't care for children well. And as I've already said, the first thing you want to do in those instances is to see if there's another family member who could take on children instead. So the final myth is we can't change the system, so we may as well work to make orphanages better places for children. And I've heard this argument many times. It's a common argument that it's just too big a problem for individuals to address, and that whilst orphanages continue to exist, we may as well continue to support them and try and make them as good as possible for children. And I've heard this used as a justification for volunteering, for donating money, for giving clothes to orphanages. And of course, there is a degree of truth in this. While orphanages continue to exist, we need to make sure that they're of good quality, that children are safe and that they're well protected and cared for. However, we also need to recognise that by supporting orphanages, we might be exacerbating the problem. And this is for two reasons. Firstly, we have a lot of evidence here in Nepal that orphanages are being used as money-making schemes, that children are being separated from families so that unscrupulous orphanage owners and managers can have full orphanages that can attract more resources from donors and here in Nepal often from volunteers. So volunteers may have to spend some money in order to volunteer, or they may continue to fundraise after they've left the orphanage. So it could be that the more you give to orphanages, the more it seems like an attractive money-making proposition, and the more orphanages are likely to be built. And I really wanted to highlight that this isn't just an issue in Nepal. There's now a whole global movement called Better Volunteering, Better Care, that's done research and work in a very wide range of countries, including Ghana, Cambodia, Guatemala. So they're working all over the world. And secondly, as I've already argued, it's important to remember that orphanages are expensive, and investing money in orphanages is diverting resources away from support to families. And it's much more sustainable and much more important for children's well-being that we spend our resources on families. So if we're going to support orphanages, we need to support the right kinds of orphanages. And I would say that these are those that focus on short-term care with a very strong emphasis on children's reintegration, that they have clear entry procedures, so they're really considering each individual case of the child and making sure that the child really needs to be in the orphanages and there's no, you can't immediately return them back to their families. That it organises care in a way that the child can bond with their carer, that they have very strong procedures to prevent and respond to abuse and bullying, for example, that they vet all their staff, and very importantly, that they don't rely on unskilled volunteers to provide direct care to children. So I think children in orphanages are often very, very vulnerable children already. They've often experienced the trauma of being separated from their families in the first place, and while they've been apart, they may have been trafficked, abused, and exploited. And they really need professional support. And I personally am not convinced that an 18-year-old on their gap year can provide the level of support that these children need. And I feel very strongly that these standards need to apply no matter how poor a country is. And here in Nepal, I know there are many very skilled Nepali child protection workers who know the language, they understand the context, and they're far better placed to support children than volunteers from outside of Nepal. And I would encourage you, if you're still not convinced, to reflect whether in your country you would find it acceptable for a young person from another country, another culture, doesn't speak the language, with very limited skills, to play a key role in the care of abused and neglected children in your context. So I think if you still want to support orphanages and you're convinced that you found an orphanage that ticks all these boxes, that is a good orphanage, that is offering the right kinds of support to children, then we need to make sure that we offer the right kinds of support. And there are other ways of offering support that don't involve volunteering directly with children. So for example, donating money, fundraising, offering behind-the-scenes support in the administration of the charities that support the orphanages. There are other ways that you can assist vulnerable children. So I want to finish up by just talking to you briefly about what you can do. What are some of the things that you can do to help children here in Nepal? So the first thing I would say is don't come away with this thinking there's nothing I can do. I think there is a lot that you can do as individuals to support children in Nepal, and I very much hope that you're inspired to do this. But please don't volunteer in an orphanage. One of the things that you can do is spread the word. So we have a reasonably good turnout here, but we could have more people coming to these talks, so you can tell them about them. They're happening every week. Often we feel like we're preaching to the converted when we have these conversations, because it's people who already have a degree of commitment to this issue and are interested in children's welfare that are coming here. So we'd really encourage you to share what you've learned with other people travelling in Nepal and other people volunteering in Nepal. We'd like you to adopt a learning mindset to volunteering, and this means accepting that you have a lot to learn before you can contribute effectively to supporting children or helping Nepal in other ways. We'd like you to volunteer appropriately if you are going to volunteer. So think about the skills that you have and use those skills. It may be that working directly with children is not what's needed, and it may be that your accountancy skills or your carpentry skills are more in need. I think it's very important that you research your options and ask lots of questions, and I hope that the presentation today has given you some information so that you're able to ask informed questions and make informed choices. If you want to find out more, there is a wealth of information. You can go to the Family for Every Child website, but I'd also encourage you to visit the Better Care Network website. They have lots and lots of information about the care of children and how to support the care of children. You can also be an ethical tourist, and this means spending your money on goods and services that support local people, that don't damage the environment and enhance mutual learning and understanding. And you can also report cases of child abuse. And I think I'm going to hand out that leaflet you've got. We're going to hand around a leaflet which tells you a bit more, and also it gives you numbers that you can call if you suspect cases of child abuse. And in all of this, I have to remind you, if you don't know already, that volunteering is technically illegal in Nepal under the Immigration Act. Though of course it happens all the time, and when it does happen, we'd really encourage it to happen well and happen in a way that can positively benefit children and enable them to grow up within families.